So I think the old model of leadership used to be one of you're either born with it or not. We used to think of either got these skill sets or you don't. But very much now the model of leadership is one in which we're all invited to the table. So the way that I think of leadership and teach leadership is leadership is really a set of influence behaviors. So a lot of behaviors we can learn to do. So our most elite athletes and anyone that's really good at their respective career practices it and puts a lot of effort and time into honing that craft. Oftentimes in organizations, how we move up is we're really good at being excellent in a task. Maybe it's accounting or marketing or finance, and then we ultimately get promoted to being a leader of folks who do finance.
Welcome to America's Healthiest City. I'm your host, Will Melton. Today we have Dr. Reina from the, let's get this right, Institute for Transformative Leadership at VCU. If you are new to this program, please check out americashealthiestcity.com. This is a 10-year community partnership to make the entire region of Richmond the healthiest community in America by 2033. It is a community partnership, so we need your ambassadorship, we need your ideas. We need your comments on the ideas that have already been submitted. So go check out the ideas board and learn about what it takes to be an ambassador. But without further ado, Chris, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be an exciting topic.
Yeah, wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I start off every one of these with the common question of your relationship to Richmond. Are you a native or did you come here at some point later?
So transplant, kind of been spending my life moving continually east and finally made it to Richmond about 9 years ago.
Okay, so did you start all the way west?
I did. Grew up in Southern California, San
Okay.
Diego area, then did grad school in Arizona and then had some jobs in Denver, Ohio, and then back to Arizona, and then finally to the East Coast here in Richmond.
Okay. So I think I hear kind of a dichotomy there. Some people are just like here, born and raised, never left, or they left and came back because they just there's a calling there. But then there's a lot of folks that have moved here more recently that really have ingrained themselves in Richmond, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I want to give you the opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about your experience being in Richmond and why you've chosen to put down roots here and look forward.
Sure. So Richmond, to me, I didn't know much about Richmond at all before VCU was having a job that was available. So I looked at Richmond, came out, and was pleasantly surprised. I'm a person who loves have an urban lifestyle, so living right downtown, walking to VCU campuses. I do work at both campuses. So that was a great value add that could be a very urban. To me, I love mountains, not too far away. You got the ocean not too far away, Amtrak access to DC, and you can't forget the amazing food and drink and brewery scene in Richmond is pretty awesome. Not to mention time at the river. So definitely great things about the city. And then I'm just really passionate about what VCU is doing for education, what Richmond is doing, and really seeking to be a city that folks want to be in, thrive in, and kind of makes it Richmond an even more cool city. We think of the big cities in the U.S., and I always thought that I would live in one of the top 10, but I've really found kind of a niche here in Richmond.
So I think we're kind of at that point where we're like a new restaurant every week again, post-pandemic. So that's exciting. I want to talk a little bit about philosophy and leadership and your background. So you went to school for philosophy and I don't know enough to know how that translates to leadership. So we'll talk a little bit more about leadership, but I want to talk about your education background.
Sure.
and kind of what that looked like and what caused you to kind of say that this is the path for you.
Yeah, started back in high school, just acknowledging and wondering why some people were really interesting to lead or to be led by, and others, folks really weren't led by. And so I think I've just always been interested in what draws us to some people and not to other people. So that was an initial interest. And then going off to college, happened to have a leadership institute embedded in the university or college that I went to. So I realized you could actually study it as an academic topic. So I was a psychology major, and we had what amounted to a minor in leadership studies. And so I went through that process and realized, hey, you can really understand and seek to know what it is that people are doing to be more effective leaders. So I kind of saw a path there, and then went off to the working world and had some experiences with leadership where I love the company, love the organization, love the culture, and yet ultimately left jobs because of ineffective and perhaps toxic leadership, which I think we have all probably felt. And so it kind of got me back to grad school to think about how do I become someone who can help others get better at their leadership so that they don't have their followers ultimately leave them as well. So it kind of started this cyclical process from a young age of asking why some leaders are more effective, and then ultimately helping folks not be the leaders that people leave.
Yeah. Well, I think by the time I was 18 years old, 20 years old, I had about 15 or 16 different jobs, and I kept finding myself like picking things apart and feeling like, well, I wanted to have control, but nobody wanted to listen to like a 19-year-old kid tell them how to manage their business. So yeah, I think it happens to people of all ages, and appreciate that very much.
I had a unique experience as a 16-year-old. I was at the San Diego Wild Animal Park, which is now, I think, the Safari Park in Escondido. But I was a 16 and a half year old leading a team of, I think, 20 to 30 folks that were much older than me. I was kind of the team lead. And it was still to this day one of my favorite jobs. But I definitely feel that challenge and motivating folks of all different walks of life and different ages and different life experiences.
I used to work at Busch Gardens for a very brief period of time because there were some things about it I couldn't muster on the leadership side, but that was also a fun job, and I think that I could have, if I had stuck around a little bit longer, maybe. But yeah, I had a good boss when I started, and that changed a couple weeks in, and things went downhill from there.
I understand that.
So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about just kind of my experience with education, because I don't know, kind of everybody has a different experience with education. But when I was a little kid, when I was like in middle school, I went through a peer mediation program and learned, how to do that, and got to provide that service to my peers. I ended up moving to a new place not too long after that, and that went away. But I went to VCU for a semester. Most people don't know this. I was paying the bill, so I, kind of wisely said maybe I should be here, and left, and found that life has got lots of lessons that I've learned. And what I wanted to allude to is that later on, a couple of years ago, 2020, I graduated from Leadership Metro Richmond, and I cite that on the show a lot because it's been a source of a lot of contacts that I have, and it's been a really tremendous source of this entire effort. Was born out of that. Now, you spoke to our class back in spring, not our class, but our entire organization back in spring for a spring luncheon. And that's how we met. And we didn't get a big chance to talk, but, having dug in and listening to what you had to say, you're definitely somebody that we need to have on this show. Let's talk a little bit about, how does one, provide leadership guidance to leaders? How does that come to be? What do you have to study? How do you get better at it?
Great question. So I think the old model of leadership used to be one of you're either born with it or not. We used to think of either got these skill sets or you don't. But very much now the model of leadership is one in which we're all invited to the table. So the way that I think of leadership and teach leadership is leadership is really a set of influence behaviors. So a lot of behaviors we can learn to do. So our most elite athletes and anyone that's really good at their respective career practices it and puts a lot of effort and time into honing that craft. Oftentimes in organizations, how we move up is we're really good at being excellent in a task. Maybe it's accounting or marketing or finance, and then we ultimately get promoted to being a leader of folks who do finance. And so what we're missing is this training and this acknowledgement that the skill sets that got us to the place of promotion oftentimes they're not the same skill sets to make us successful in the job of leader. And so I think when we get folks to understand that, then there's some aha moments that happen where they realize this is hard and I haven't been trained to do this. And I need to spend time to do this. I need to be mindful and intentional and set goals. And having a leadership coach is not a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of me taking my job as leader seriously. Because again, which professional athlete at the top of their game doesn't spend hours and hours each day with a coach seeking to get better? And yet I think our dominant leadership model still to this day is one in which leaders are just expected to do this craft well called leadership. And it's just not the case. So I think I start with that, and then it invites people to the table where anyone can become a better, more effective leader. And I teach the skills and the mindsets and a lot of deep reflection work of where are you at now as a leader and where do you want to be? And what are your specific obstacles that get in your way? Because I often point out to people, I mean, who of us wants to be ineffective or make people feel bad or be a leader who has our folks go home and complain about us at work? And none of us want that. And yet all of us say and do things sometimes that create that environment where people aren't happy. And so there's a little bit of that self-reflection we have to get then their eyes are open to saying, okay, I can do this better. Let's get started.
Well, coincidentally, just a couple of hours ago, I was with my leadership coach, Brooke Purcell. She's here in town. She was also a Leadership Metro Richmond graduate. And I think the takeaway from my experience is that you're always learning. I think imposter syndrome is something a lot of people have, but you have it if you aren't sure that you're rising to the occasion. I think the other side of that are people that show up with a ton of ego and think that they know everything and they're the world, and those people are less flexible. They don't learn as much. But they may not be intentional about looking for those lessons. I see that you're the president and founder of Leading Without Ego. So I want to talk a little bit about ego and its role. Before we do, I just want to remind folks, this is America's Healthiest City on ESPN Richmond 106.1, part of the Mike King Biz Media Network. Today we have Dr. Chris Reina from the Institute for Transformative Leadership at VCU. We are talking about all sorts of things leadership related and ego. That topic keeps coming up in my world, and I think it's becoming more and more prevalent as we have a bit more empathy and vulnerability around the dialogue that we have as a society. Can you tell me about ego's role?
Yeah, ego is a tough word. I think I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out if that is the best word, but I do think it is. It kind of creates a lot of feelings in us when we think about ego, but when we think about ineffective leaders, we think about perhaps toxicity that is driven by this larger than life ego. So the way I teach ego is more about how do you recognize that the way that each of us show up in life has everything to do with the sum total of all of our lived experiences. Right. So I can't see the world in a way that's not specific to me, and neither can you, and neither can anyone else. And so the ego is there. It's this guidance system that's kind of walking us through life based on the sum total of who we are. And if we got to kind of call that what it is, if we don't, then I can't really empathize with you. I can't really be compassionate to you because I'm only seeing my own perspective. And so from a mindfulness perspective, what we can do is actually what I call decentering. We can decenter. So instead of seeing me as the center of the world, I can actually step back and I can see me and you, and I'm almost this observer that can see both of us. So it's this decentered way of thinking, which I think makes room for the ego to get out of the way. And so I think we say, often colloquially, don't have an ego. And I think dropping the ego or moving away from ego-based processing would be helpful. But I think in general, what's the best thing leaders can do is just acknowledge that ego seeks to protect us, and it's based on a lot of stuff we've experienced. But as soon as we take all that and then put that on other people, or assume that we have the right answer, or we assume that we can really understand someone's experience, that's an ego-based response. Not necessarily problematic in its own right. It's seeking to protect us, but we have to be kind of bigger than that. And when we see it in perspective, then we can drop the ego and I think more deeply connect with our fellow person.
So I had an opportunity to read a great book. Wish I could remember the author, but the book's called Zero Limits, and it's based on a Hawaiian philosophy called, I think, Ho'opa Ono. And it's the idea that our life is the sum of our experiences. And when when you have problems, if you can imagine those experiences being eliminated, if you can go back to the day you were born and see the world through fresh eyes, you wouldn't have this negative response to things, or maybe even a positive response to things until you've kind of built those memories up. I've read a lot of books about that because I feel like I don't just feel like, I know a lot of people experience a lot of pain as they move through life because they're constantly living life through the filter of maybe some painful thing that happened in the past.
Absolutely. I mean, it really forms the basis of what we call beginner's mind. It's the same idea of can you approach a situation with a person or a life experience and experience it fresh with new eyes. If we can do that, or we can at least say, I'm open to it, that puts us in a different perspective than it does assuming we know the result that will play out. Because as soon as we know what someone's going to say or think we know, right, that's when we're actually kind of creating the energy toward that end result, which may or may not be effective for them. And if they know that you're not really listening and you're not really caring and the outcome is already predetermined as a leader, how many of us kind of say, we don't really feel listened to by our leader? And if we do, we know they're just sort of going through the motion. So dropping the ego has someone in the leadership role actually deeply listen and be open. It doesn't then mean that they follow the instructions every time or the suggestions, but there's this making space for the other person where they can really feel heard, feel valued. And then I would argue from a leadership perspective, if you don't utilize someone's idea, connect with them as a human about why. Just say, hey, I was weighing a lot of things. This is kind of how I ended up making the decision. Your inputs were really valued. Because I find in leadership, what happens and what breaks a lot of trust is when folks feel that their inputs don't match the outputs. They just give you all this information. They sweated all night and got the project done that you wanted. And then it just goes into this black hole and they never hear back. Their inputs are not connected to an output. Typically, if leaders can just be human centered and people centered in their approach, saying, this person did a lot of work, let me connect the outcome to their work. And the outcome doesn't mean they utilized all the info, but they said, hey, I weighed it. This is how we used it. These are the different constraints we had, and this is what we ultimately came to. Again, I don't think people want to always have their ideas be the idea, but they do want to feel like procedurally their inputs were valued.
Well, I can also imagine a world where, you kind of talked about conditioning earlier, like with enough of that pattern going on, eventually you stop injecting ideas because you feel like, why bother putting energy in? So I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of things, but I'll start with the program because for anybody who's a young person or maybe not a young person looking to come into your program, what does it look like? What kind of experiences can people expect as they look at that?
Sure. So there's kind of a few different ways to engage. So the Institute for Transformative Leadership at the VCU School of Business kind of offers training for local organizations in person and virtually. So that's an option if you're looking for sort of one-off training for dyads or small teams or organizations. So that's one way to engage when it comes to degrees and ways of sort of earning degrees at VCU School of Business. We have an MBA program in 3 different ways: so the executive MBA, the evening MBA, and the online MBA. And so those programs have various focuses on leadership. So that's the way that you could kind of study that in a more rigorous way. Am I getting to what you're thinking?
Yeah,
or are you thinking
yeah. Well,
like...
just so that folks know what the program does. I think that we talk leadership kind of esoterically and
Right.
miss the details. That people are curious. So yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think if folks are curious about what to do now, maybe differently, and maybe they choose to study it in a more specific way or over a longer time, I think there's a few things you can do. So there's sort of what we call lunch and learn experiences through the Institute, where maybe you sign up and you get lunch and you talk about sort of these topics. So a lot of the work that I do is what I call planting a seed. You don't really know what it's doing, but you plant the seed and you water it and you nourish it, and then over time you've kind of shifted the way you think of leadership. And practice groups are a really great way to do that. And it's why we love as humans to be with others. So come together for a lunch, come together for an evening activity, talk about an aspect of leadership. And the other thing is leadership is kind of lonely. We often can't share everything we want with our followers. We can't really share everything above us in the organizational hierarchy. And we have to be a little careful on how much we tell our peers, because to some extent, even though we seek to remove competition, there's a little bit of competitive nature. So I think if you have a practice group, if you will, of other leaders from various industries, you can create a safer place where you can talk about, how did you handle this particular idea? Or I'm getting this roadblock, how might I move beyond it? So I'm just kind of thinking some ideas on the spot of who's the leader you want to be, and sort of how do you fine tune some of those aspects. And then maybe it's a weekly retreat or a cycle, or it could be a class you take, or it could just be one-on-one coaching with an individual in which you kind of bring what's heavy on your heart or what's roadblocking you in the business world, and your coach can kind of help you think through those aspects.
So, one of the things that I work on very intentionally is, we're kind of responding as we're looking to grow. We're trying to respond to what we see as maybe the negative things, the less desirable things. And so I work with my coach on building tools that are tailored to my life and to my challenges to be able to kind of overcome and quite frankly, cope with a busy world. Can you talk a little bit about tools that you would point people to as they think about opening up their mind and considering how they might become better leaders?
Number one, I would think broadly around this concept of mindfulness. It's kind of become a household word now and very colloquially expressed. But I think there's some very specific things you can learn about mindfulness. And so the way I describe and coach folks to be mindful is this idea that we can control with much more ability than we think our minds kind of thoughts and emotions. And so if we can start to say that the busy mind and all these emotions that we experience, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of them, but they're busy and they kind of create confusion and chaos. And if we can start to see that, again, we can decenter and step out of that own ego. We can say, well, these thoughts and emotions are interesting. They may or may not be rooted in reality, but yet my kind of approach to dealing with others is very much informed by this tension that I feel in my body and my mind. And oftentimes just that simple shift of recognizing, yeah, this is a busy mind and it says I'm super stressed. Am I super stressed? What's the root of that stress? And as we ask why, and as we sit with it, oftentimes it goes away because there's no root of it. Sometimes the root is just the busy mind. And so mindfulness broadly kind of defined as a way to do that. Now, people always say, like, do I have to meditate? Do I have to sit in silence? Do I have to do yoga? And I think those tools are very effective ways to be mindful. But the way that I think about mindfulness more broadly is mindfulness is being more intentional with your attention. So maybe that's going to the gym and it's putting your cell phone down and it's really being in the moment and not letting all the thoughts from work continually creep in. Maybe it's going on a walk in the middle of the day and enjoying nature and that moment just being good enough. Maybe it's what I coach a lot of leaders to do is 2 minutes before a meeting in your office, how do you set an intention for what you hope people experience in that meeting? It may sound simple, right? We would say, oh, I want them to feel hopeful and optimistic. But even just calling that out and saying what I hope to bring about in this 30-minute meeting is that people feel aligned and they feel hopeful. And then we actually show up in a way that actually makes it happen. But we have to be intentional. So what I call is micro mindful moments. We don't have to necessarily sit for 10 minutes and practice mindfulness. I think we'd be better off for it, and we should, but that's not where I start people. Start them in a series of micro mindful moments in which we just recognize that we are more in control than we think.
You're listening to America's Healthiest City on ESPN Richmond 106.1. Today we have Dr. Chris Reina from the Institute for Transformative Leadership at VCU. That is a mouthful. Thank you for being on. We've got a few more minutes, so I really want to extract a few more nuggets from you. I will just say leadership is lonely. If anybody out there is a leader, be mindful of that fact. I actually, it physically plays out when I'm walking with my team and I find myself in front of everybody with nobody next to me. And and I say something about it because it happens all too often. But I wanted to talk, you had mentioned, this human, really just basic human notion of, I'm just human, that all this stuff that's external to me is not, it's not necessarily needs to be present right now in my mind. It's not necessarily affecting me right now. I probably have time to deal with it later. But we're in a world, I'm in the digital marketing world. So I'm probably part of the reason why we suffer from this. There's just a lot of information. As we think back to Richmond and how we can make change happen here locally, whether leaders feel lonely and frustrated by that, or if they're out there connecting and making things happen, I wanted to give you a chance to share with our audience ways that we might look to change things either as individuals or as a whole society. And we'll put this idea on the ideas board so that other folks can leave their comments too.
It goes back to a theme that we were talking about a bit earlier, this idea that maybe setting time aside each day for each of us and to recognize that we're worth it and we should be doing it. It's this idea of what we often say in airplanes, right? Put your mask on before you affix it to the person next to you or a loved one. And so we have to take care of ourselves. And sometimes we let that go. Oftentimes we let that go. As leaders, we're sort of outward focused, which is what we think we need to be. Yet if we're not taking care of ourselves, if we're not feeling fulfilled and well-being, actually what we're giving to the world and to our followers is not the best. And so by focusing on the followers, we're actually potentially hurting the followers if we think about it from a mindfulness perspective. If we think instead about how do I create an experience for followers, a transformative experience, how do I think about from start to finish what that's going to look like? What do I want them to feel? How do I get out of the way? How do I provide this kind of cyclical reinforcement of this is where we want to go come into that journey with me. And so you're bringing people in to the fold. And so I guess what I would say to the folks listening would be, how do you spend 5 minutes, maybe 5 minutes at first, maybe get to 15 at some point, but 5 minutes each day, kind of with quiet, with reflection, with a deeper understanding of your own personal values. And then you can see, if you're mindful, like, if these are my values, X, Y, and Z, how do I ensure my behaviors each day reinforce X, Y, and Z? And when we see that we're actually doing different behaviors, then we can recognize, well, I need to fine tune that. I need to reduce the gap between who I am and what I do, because that gap is what's actually harming ourselves and maybe harming followers. But if we're intentional, I think we can bring about that very set of behaviors that we want. And I think for leadership, it makes all the difference in the world, because what do people say? And they get frustrated when we say one thing and do another. And so I think if we kind of push those together, we say and do the same thing, that builds trust in ourselves and trust in others.
So I recently was scrolling through LinkedIn and I saw comparative brain scans between people who had back-to-back meetings versus people who scheduled small gaps in between. And that just looking at those brain scans, I don't know how, scientific they were or whatever, but it just said, we need to do this. And there's a setting in Gmail where you can actually change it.
Yep.
So your meetings are automatic. We've done that. Those extra couple of minutes are everything. Everything. I really appreciate that. So one of the other questions that we ask folks who come on the show is, who's somebody who you look up to in the community, or you just, see is doing good work that we might consider reaching out to and bringing onto the show?
So in the spirit of kind of helping Richmond, the School of Business, VCU, I think, become a more caring place, someone that comes to mind is the new dean of the School of Business, Dr. Naomi Boyd. She is quite vocal about creating a culture of care and figuring out what that means. And so how do we really make students and faculty and staff and administrators feel more care, that they feel like they belong, and that they ultimately feel cared for. And so I think when it comes to, again, starting within, part of the Institute's goal is to how do we transform continually the leadership in VCU so that all of us, faculty, staff, students, feel more of it, and then we can give more of it to the local community and beyond. So I'd recommend, she's a PhD in finance, which is fascinating in its own right, and then yet is all about creating and crafting transformative experiences for others in this really compassionate way. And so it's a really neat, I think, future direction for the School of Business as we seek to be a transformative force for good.
Well, maybe we'll get a warm introduction. I can always spend more time with people that know about finance.
Absolutely.
So this is America's Healthiest City. Please visit americashealthiestcity.com to check out our ideas board. Leave your comments. If you represent a business, a nonprofit, a government institution, or an academic institution, please consider becoming an ambassador. It is free. We only ask you to put your strategic decisions through the filter, which asks, how will this decision make our community healthier? So we had Dr. Chris Reina today. Super excited to have you. We're going to have you back because we got to talk more about this loneliness piece and a lot of other things. But thank you so much for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.